My parents said, "We're giving the family business to your brother, you understand?" I said, "Completely." Then I started my own company. 2 years later, they asked me to bail out his failing operation. I sent them a brochure for business loans. That was the moment I realized everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed, had been for nothing. The family business, which I had practically run for years, was being handed over to my younger brother, Colin. And not because he was better qualified or more capable, but because he was the golden child, the one with the business degree and the perfect life, the one who could do no wrong. I had always known it, of course. The favoritism, the double standards, but hearing it laid out so bluntly, with no room for argument, hit harder than I expected. I'd spent 8 years learning the trade, building relationships with clients, handling the tough jobs, doing everything that father never seemed to have time for. And now it was all being handed to Colin. It wasn't even a surprise at this point, but it still stung. Colin didn't deserve the company. He didn't know anything about it. He'd barely worked a day in his life at Morrison Heating and Cooling. He'd spent his summers at the lake house while I learned how to install systems, fix compressors, and run operations. The idea of him running the place was laughable. But no one was asking me. No one was listening. The irony was I didn't even want the damn thing anymore. Not under those circumstances. But I'd given everything, earned my place, or at least I thought I had. But now, I had nothing. I wasn't even offered a shot at ownership. Just a promise to stay on, to continue fixing the messes he'd create. My father even said, "You'll need to help Colin with the technical side of things." So, I started planning. I quietly began saving, documenting my achievements, building relationships outside the family business. It wasn't just about getting out. It was about proving to myself that I didn't need them, that I could build something of my own. And that's exactly what I did. While Colin took the reins, basking in his new title, I started a new company, Colin Control. It wasn't easy. Nothing worth having ever is. But it was mine. From the ground up. And no one could take that from me. Looking back, I realize how much of it came down to that single conversation. The moment I was told I didn't matter. I knew then I'd never go back to that world. I'd never beg for a seat at the table again. So, I created my own. That was just the beginning. Growing up, I always knew who the favorite was. It wasn't even subtle. Colin had always been the one who could do no wrong, and I was the one who could never seem to measure up. There was no mystery about it. Everyone saw it, from our neighbors to our extended family. Even Uncle Ray, who had no problem pointing out the flaws in my parents' approach, pulled me aside when I was 17 and said, "They're setting him up to fail, you know?" At the time, I didn't get it. I thought it was just jealousy that maybe Uncle Ray didn't understand. But looking back, he was right. The difference between Colin and me was clear from the moment we were born. I was the first son, the one who had to work for everything. I had a curfew at 10 p.m. until I moved out at 23, but Colin, by the time he was 16, he had to maintain a B average to keep my car. Colin. He failed 2 classes senior year and still got a brand new truck for graduation. I didn't resent him for it. I loved my brother, or at least I thought I did, but I resented the way my parents acted, as though he could do no wrong. While I was working summers at Dad's HVAC company, learning the trade from the ground up, Colin was spending his lake house with his friends, living the life of someone who never had to work for anything. And even when I was in high school, hustling every summer, my parents barely acknowledged the effort. When I turned 14, I started working for Dad at Morrison Heating and Cooling, the company he built from a one-trunk operation to a fleet of 12 vehicles with 23 employees. The pay wasn't great, but it was something. And it was what I knew. I worked every position, hauled equipment, cleaned job sites, became an apprentice installer, by lead installer. By the time I was 22, I had my contractor's license, and I was running service calls independently. I had worked every day of my life for that company, but it didn't matter. It wasn't my company. Not officially. Colin, on the other hand, had it easy. He went to a state school on our parents' dime, barely scraped by with a 2.6 GPA, and didn't even bolt home to help out during the summer. He barely came by the shop once, let alone work there. Yet somehow, when he graduated, Dad threw this huge party at the country club, rented out the banquet room, invited Rome from the Chamber of Commerce, and made this big speech about how proud he was of Colin for getting his business degree, and how he was ready to take the company into the future. Meanwhile, I was standing in the back in my work clothes because I had come straight from a job site. I wasn't in tote. It was supposed to be a formal event. And Colin, he was up front in a new suit, soaking up all the attention, and hadn't spent a single day learning how a heat exchanger worked. That should have been my first clue. But it wasn't. The next week, Colin joined the company as the business development manager. He had a salary that was $20 more than mine, even though I had been there for years. His job title was vague, something about finding growth opportunities and building strategic partnerships, but it was all about taking clients out to lunch on the company card, lunches with people who had no interest in working with us. Meanwhile, I was working myself into the ground, doing everything from handling the actual operations to managing delivery, scheduling, dealing with difficult clients, training new employees, and still running service calls when we were short-staffed. And I didn't get a raise. Dad pulled me aside a few months after Colin started and said, "You know, Colin's still learning the business. You need to give him time." Time? Time for what? Time to continue wasting company money. I had been running operations for years, but now Colin was the one getting the praise. And that's when the cracks started to show. Colin was unprepared, unqualified, and completely out of his depth. He made mistakes, big mistakes that I had to clean up. Clients started leaving, and one of our biggest commercial accounts, a property management company that had been with us for 12 years, decided to switch to a competitor. The account was worth around $280,000 annually. Colin had misquoted them, trying to use tracing strategies he barely remembered from a business class he'd taken in college. When I confronted Dad about it, he said, "Colin's still learning the sales process. Sometimes you lose if you don't understand the game." That's when I realized I was the one doing all the work. I was the one who had built relationships with clients, who made sure we delivered quality service, who had earned the trust of suppliers and contractors. And yet, Colin was the one who got all the credit. And the worst part, Dad didn't see it. He kept making excuses for Colin, defending him at every turn. The favoritism was so blatant, I almost couldn't stand anymore. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it wasn't just about Colin. It was about Dad, too. Dad had built this company from the ground up with his own hands, working 16-hour days, managing every part of the operation. But now, he was blinded by a fantasy he had created about Colin's potential. No matter how bad things got, he refused to acknowledge that his youngest son wasn't ready for the role he had been given. And that's when I started to understand the business wasn't just about the work. It was about something else entirely. It was about Dad's legacy, his story, and I was just a pawn in it. The more I saw of Colin in the company, the more obvious it became that he was a liability. He was charming enough, but when it came to actually managing the business, he was lost. It didn't take long for him to make one bad decision after another, and every time, I was the one who had to clean the mess. One of the first big problems came about 6 months after he joined. Colin had been tasked with renewing a maintenance contract with one of our biggest commercial clients, a property management company that oversaw 47 apartment complexes across the greater Phoenix area. This account was worth roughly $280,000 annually. It was a huge deal. Losing it would eat company, maybe irreparably. But Colin didn't take it seriously. He went to the meeting unprepared. He hadn't even reviewed the client's old contract, hadn't bothered to go over any of the service history. Instead, he just waltzed in with a few notes he'd scribbled down and tried to pitch a new contract that was 40 higher than market rate. The client's account rep told me later that Colin acted as though they were lucky to be working with a premium service provider. They weren't impressed. When I found out, I was livid. I called Dad right away to tell him what happened. I thought for sure this would be the breaking point. Maybe Dad would see that Colin didn't have a clue what he was doing, but no. Dad just said, "Colin's still learning the sales process. You have to lose a few to understand the game. A few." We just lost $250,000 in guaranteed revenue because Colin had tried to wing it with no preparation. That wasn't learning. That was incompetence. This wasn't an isolated incident, either. The more I worked with Colin, the more I realized that his failures weren't just mistakes. They were the result of a fundamental misunderstanding of how the business actually worked. He'd never learned the trade. He didn't know how to talk to clients, how to manage people, how to troubleshoot issues when things went wrong, and yet kept giving him more responsibility, more praise. I started to resent the whole situation. Colin would create problems and I would fix them. Dad would make excuses, telling me to be patient, that Colin was too finding his way. Meanwhile, I was running the entire operation. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning to get the trucks ready for the day, handle the scheduling, manage inventory, deal with suppliers. Then, after a long day of service calls, I'd go home, only to come back the next morning and do it all over again. Colin, he'd roll in at 10 a.m., leave at 3 p.m., and spend most of his time taking clients to lunch or meeting friends at the golf course. The worst part wasn't even the favoritism anymore. It wasn't just the fact that Colin was getting paid more for doing far less. It was watching Dad ignore the reality of the situation. Colin was objectively bad at every part of the business, but Dad couldn't see it. He had this idea in his head that Colin was somehow destined to take over, that he was the future of the company, even though the evidence didn't support it. Every time I tried to bring it up, Dad would just pull me aside and say things like, "Give him time, he's learning." There was no more time to give. The company was losing clients, and it was losing money. But instead of fixing things, Dad was burying his head in the sand, hoping it would all work out. By then, I'd been working at Morrison Heating and Cooling for nearly 8 years. I knew every client, every supplier, But none of that seemed to matter. The work I had done for the company, the relationships I had built, the systems and approved, were being completely disregarded. And what hurt the most was that I wasn't even allowed to have a say. I wasn't even given a shot at running the business. Colin got the title of Business Development Manager and a salary that was $20,000 more than mine, despite the fact that I had been doing the work for years. The idea that he was somehow more qualified to run the company than me was laughable. But it wasn't funny anymore. I was tired of cleaning up Colin's messes. I was tired of being the one who held everything together while my parents and my brother acted as though nothing was part. And the worst part, no one seemed to care that I was drowning. At that point, I knew what I had to do. I had to start planning my exit, because if I didn't, I'd be stuck in this cycle forever, watching as the company worked so hard to build fell apart under Cullen's incompetence, and knowing I'd never get the recognition I deserved. Brooke saw it long before I did. We were sitting at the kitchen table one night after a family dinner where Dad had spent the entire evening telling Mark Collins' brilliant marketing ideas, which were nothing more than a collection of buzzwords he had picked up from podcasts. The more I listened to my father praise Colin, the angrier I became, but I kept it to myself as I always did. Brooke wasn't one to hold back. "They're going to give him the company, she said, looking at me across the table. Her voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the seriousness of her words. I shook my head. "Dad's not in the way." "Harry," she said, her tone soft but firm. "He's your dad. He's been grooming Colin for this for years. You've seen it. You know it's coming." I didn't want to believe her. For all the times I'd been overlooked, I still had hope that would come around. But deep down, I knew she was right. I had watched it happen for years, and the more I tried to prove myself, the more it felt like nothing would change. "I'd just leave," I said, pushing my plate away. "I built this company. I've spent my entire adult life working with Dad. I'm not going to just walk away from it. You have to prepare, Harry, just in case. You don't want to be caught right when it happens." She was right, of course. But I wasn't ready to admit it yet. I didn't want to think about leaving the business, about starting over. The thought of it filled me with a strange and dread and excitement. But I had no choice. If I didn't prepare, I would be stuck in the same cycle, endlessly picking up the pieces while Colin reaped the worth. Over the next few months, I started doing exactly what Brooke had suggested. I saved more aggressively, cutting back on everything I could. I documented every project I had worked on, every saw I had brought in, every system I had implemented. I made sure I had proof of everything, proof that I had earned my place in the company, even if my name wasn't on the ownership papers. I also started reaching out to suppliers and contractors, quietly building relationships outside of Morrison Heat Cooling. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I didn't know exactly what I would do if the worst happened, but I knew I had to be ready. The hardest part wasn't being the plan. It was convincing myself to follow through. I had spent years trying to make my father see me as more than just an employee. I had tried to show him that I was actable, that I could run the company just as well as anyone. But he never seemed to see it. Colin was always the one who had the potential, the one who could take over and lead the company into the future. I had been told for so long that I was the behind, the scenes guy, the worker, not the leader. It wasn't easy, but I started making peace with the idea of leaving. I started to realize that even if I wasn't the heir at the company, I didn't have to stick around and watch it fall apart. Brooke and I spent late nights planning, mapping out the details of my exit strategy. I had enough savings to cover costs for a few months, and with Brooke's income covering the mortgage and living expenses, I knew I could make it work. I didn't need the family business to succeed. I just needed to prove that I could do it on my own. We discussed everything, what I would call my new company, what services I would offer, and how I would set myself in Morrison Heating and Cooling. I wasn't interested in competing on price. I wasn't going to undercut anyone to steal clients. I wanted to offer something different, premium service for customers who valued quality over cost. That's when Colmed Control was born. It wasn't just a business, it was my way out, my way to prove to myself that I could stand on my own without my father's name or Colin's mistakes holding me back. It was scary, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the only choice I had left. And so, I started. I didn't tell anyone at work. I didn't want to make a scene. I just started building, step by step. I reached out to my uncle Ray, who had owned a successful electrical contracting business for years. He knew everyone in the trade, and when I told him I was starting my own company, he didn't hesitate. About time. He said, "I've been wondering how long you'd let them treat you like hired help. What do you need? Advice, connections, maybe some referrals when you get started." I didn't have to ask for anything more. Ray offered his support without me even asking for it. And it wasn't just Ray. I started calling the contractors I had worked with over the years, building managers, AT suppliers, even former employees who had left because they couldn't stand working with Colin. Every single one of them was supportive, eager to work with me once I had my own company. In less than a week, I had commitments for startup work worth about $75,000. It wasn't enough to retire on, but it was enough to prove that my reputation was stronger than I had realized. I kept adding at Morrison Heating and Cooling, just like I always had. I didn't make a scene. I didn't quit outright. I didn't want to make a mess, but every day I did less and less. I stopped going above and beyond. I stopped fixing Colin's mistakes. I did my job and nothing more. Dad noticed, of course. He pulled me aside one day, gave me one of those concerned looks and said, "You know, you need to support Colin during this transition period. This is hard for him, too." I just nodded, even though it felt like my blood was boiling. The idea that I was the one being asked to support Colin, the one who had spent years cleaning up after him, made me sick. But I didn't argue. I didn't need to. I knew what was coming. I was already planning my exit. At that point, I had started working on the future. I just hadn't yet figured out when or how I would break away. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that if I didn't do it soon, I would never be able to escape. The conversation happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember it well because I had just finished a brutal installation job at a commercial building downtown. The temperature had reached 110 degrees, and I was drenched in sweat, filthy from crawling under ductwork, but I was looking forward to a cold drink and a hot shower. Then my phone rang. It was Dad. "We need to talk," he said, his voice unusually tense. I felt a knot in my stomach. I had a sinking feeling about what was coming, but I didn't say anything. I just agreed to meet. He said Mom would be there too, and Colin was strangely absent. I walked into their office, my body still feeling the weight of the day's work, and found them sitting across from each other. Dad looked up when I walked in, his face calm but somehow guarded. Mom's expression was the same. I took a seat across from them, expecting the usual pleasantries. Instead, Dad took a deep breath and started. "Harry, your mother and I have been talking, and we need to discuss the future of the business." He began. "We've been thinking a lot about succession planning, about what's next." I tried not to show it, but my heart sank. I'd already feel where this was going. "You know, Harry," he continued, "we've always talked about passing down the company to you and Colin. We wanted it to stay in the family, and you've been an integral part of the business for so long. We value everything you've done." I nodded, trying to keep my face neutral. I could feel my pulse quickening. This wasn't going to be easy. "Today's we've made a decision," Dad said, his voice still calm, but it didn't reach his eyes. "After much thought and discussion, your mother and I have decided that Colin will take over as president and majority of Morrison Heating and Cooling." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't a surprise, but hearing it from him, after all the years of hard work I had put in, was like a slap in the face. My throat tightened, but I didn't say anything. Dad leaned back in his chair, looking relieved. "We've decided it's time to give him that responsibility. He's got the education, the business background, and we believe he's the right one to lead the company into the future." I looked at Mom. She was watching me with a softness in her eyes, like she expected me to understand. "We think Colin is better positioned to take the company forward," she said gently. "He'll need your expertise, of course. You'll still be invaluable for operations." I blinked, trying to process what they were saying. It felt surreal. "So, I'll still be here, just working under asked," my voice calm but the thread of disbelief running through it. "Doing all the work, like I always have." Dad shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable. Well, of course, Harry, you'll stay on. Colin need you to with the technical side. He doesn't know the business like you do. I swallowed hard. But you're giving him the title? The ownership. We think it's time for him to step up. Dad said, his voice more measured now, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. I let the silence hang in the air. For a moment, I couldn't find the words. The years I had spent building this company, working weekends, staying late, fixing problems no one else could, and now this was the reward. I wasn't even getting a shot at leading it. My younger brother, who had no experience running the company, was being handed the keys to it. I glanced at Mom, hoping for some sign that she understood how wrong this was, but she just nodded in agreement. This is what we've decided, Harry. We're all in this together, and we think this will be best for the family business. I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my emotions in check. When does this happen? We're planning the transition for 6 months from now, Dad said, his tone firm. That gives Colin time to get more familiar with the operations, and you'll still be here guiding him. 6 months. They were giving me 6 months to adjust to the fact that my little brother, who barely knew the business, was going to be in charge of it, and all I was going to be was the guy who kept it running. The guy who did all the real work while Colin took credit for it. Okay, I said, my voice level. I understand. Aren't relieved? Good. We're glad you're understanding about this. But I wasn't understanding. Not really, I was angry. And I was hurt. But I couldn't show it. I wasn't going to make a scene. That wasn't who I was. But I wasn't going to stick around and watch this train wreck either. That night, I told Brooke what happened. She wasn't surprised, just angry on my behalf. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice calm but filled breath. I took a deep breath, leaning against the kitchen counter. I'm going to start my own company. She raised an eyebrow, not even the slightest bit surprised. Tomorrow, I said, a spark of determination in my voice. She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile I was used to. It wasn't a happy one. It was the smile of someone who knew that a fight was coming, a battle, and this time I wasn't going to lose. We spent the rest of the night planning what I would call the company, what my first steps would be. I was starting from scratch, but this time it was going to be on my terms. And for once I was the one in control. I walked away from that conversation feeling a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. They had made their choice, and now I was going to make mine. The first few weeks after I made the decision to leave were a blur of frantic action. The hardest part was figuring out where to start. I couldn't just quit my job at Morrison Heating and Cooling and expect everything to fall into place. I needed a plan, something solid. So I began laying the groundwork for my new company, Coleman Climate Control. I started by reaching out to people I knew in the industry. I called my Uncle Ray first. He had always been straight with me, and I knew he had connections. When I told him what I was planning, there was no hesitation on his part. About time, he said, almost like he'd been expecting this. I've been wondering how long you'd let them treat you like hired help. What do you need? Advice, connections, maybe some referrals when you get started. I was relieved. Ray didn't ask questions or try to talk me out of it. He just offered his help. I didn't have to beg for it. He spread the word for me, told everyone he knew that I was starting my own company. That was the first step. Next, I called Linda, our primary supply vendor. I'd worked with her for years, and we had a good relationship. I wasn't sure if she'd be open to doing business with me once I left the family company, but when I told her my plans, she didn't skip a beat. Harry, she said, I've been waiting for this call for years. Your dad's account is only as good as it is because of you. Colin can barely tell a compressor from a condenser coil. You want credit terms? I'll match whatever I've been giving Morrison, and your account rep will actually know what she's talking about. The support I got from people like Ray and Linda was overwhelming. It gave me confidence, but the real test would be whether I could turn that support into a viable business. So I started making more calls, reaching out to contractors I had worked with in the past, building managers who tested me specifically for service calls. Every conversation was the same. People were excited for me. They didn't want to work with Colin, they wanted to work with me. I wasn't interested in competing on price. I wasn't to undercut anyone just to get a job. But what I could offer was something different, premium service, backed by years of experience and a reputation for doing things right. I was determined to build a business that wasn't about being the cheapest option, but about delivering quality. Within a week, I had commitments for startup work worth about $75,000. It wasn't huge, but enough to prove to myself that this could work. The word was getting out, and people were willing to take a chance on me. I kept working at Morrison Heating and Cooling just as I had been. I didn't want to make waves, but every day I stopped volunteering for extra projects. I stopped going above and beyond to fix Colin's mistakes. I just did the bare minimum, showed up, did my job, and left. It wasn't long before Dad started to notice the change. He pulled me aside one day, his usual concerned look on his face. "Harry," he said, "you're not putting in the effort like you used to. Colin's going to need your help during this transition period. This is hard for him too." I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. "I'm doing exactly what I'm being paid to do," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Nothing more, nothing less." Dad didn't respond. He just looked at me like I was the problem, like I was the one being unreasonable. But I didn't care anymore. I had made up my mind. I was done. 3 months after the succession announcement, I filed the incorporation papers for common climate control. It was official now. There was no going back. I knew the risks. Starting a business was never easy. But I had something no one else could take from me, my reputation. I had built it up over the years with every client I worked with, every service call I completed, every contractor who trusted me to get the job done right. I didn't have an office. I didn't have employees yet, but I had a vision, and that was enough. The first few months were the hardest. I worked 70-hour weeks, doing everything from high-end installations to emergency service calls. But every job was mine. Every client was mine, and every dollar I made was a reflection of the work I had put in. As word spread, the business began to grow. I wasn't just doing side work on weekends anymore. I was taking on full projects, expanding my client base. The quality of my work spoke for itself, and the referrals started coming in faster than I could handle. My reputation was my biggest asset, and that was when I knew I had made the right choice. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. In the meantime, I kept my distance from Morrison Heating and Cooling. I showed up every day, did my job, and didn't get involved in the drama. But as the days passed, it became clearer and clearer that I had made the right decision to leave. The cracks in the foundation of Morrison Heating and Cooling were starting to show. I wasn't there to fix them anymore, and Colin was nowhere near capable of stepping up to the plate. I knew things were going to fall apart. It was only a matter of time, but I wasn't going to be there to watch it happen. I had moved on, and now it was time to make something of my own. The day I handed in my resignation letter was one of the strangest of my life. It wasn't the anger or the excitement I had expected. It was just calm. I walked into the office, no drama, no scene, and handed the letter to the office manager. She looked at me, surprised, but I didn't say anything. I just turned and walked out. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But at the same time, it felt like something was missing. I was at 12 years of my life at Morrison Heating and Cooling. I had invested so much into that place. But it didn't matter anymore. I had my own business now, and that was all that mattered. Colin called me less than after I had turned in my resignation letter. His voice was frantic. "What is this about resigning?" he demanded. "Dad's going to lose it. What does it matter?" I asked. "You'll figure it out. You can't just leave." We, I said, biting back a laugh. "You need me." "Colin, you've never needed me." There was a long silence on the other end. I knew he didn't have a response for that. Finally, he spoke again, his voice smaller now. "Where are you going? What opportunity do you have?" I didn't want to tell him. I didn't know him an explanation, but I couldn't leave him in the dark either. "I started my own company." You started your own business? Are you serious?" "Yeah, I am." I hung up before he could say anything else. The conversation was over. I didn't expect Dad to call me. I didn't want him to, honestly. But the next day his number popped up on my phone. I debated ignoring it, but something made me pick up. "Harry," Dad's voice was cold, distant. "We need to talk." I wasn't sure how to respond. "About what?" "About your resignation. I don't understand why you've been this. We've always been a family business. I thought we were all in this together." I could feel the guilt trip coming a mile away, and part of me was tempted to let it get to me. But I didn't. My choice. I made my choice, Dad. I'm not going to be stuck in a place where I'm not valued. I'm building my own future now. His voice softened. "You're being emotional, Harry? This isn't like you." "No, this is exactly like me," I said. "This is me taking control of my life for the first time in a long time." Dad didn't have much to say after that. He tried to convince me to come back to the family business. He told me that I was making a mistake, that Colin would need me more than ever. But I wasn't listening anymore. He had made his decision, and now I was making mine. That night, I went home to Brooke, and I told her everything. She was the first person I had told about my resignation, the first person who truly understood what I had been dealing with all these years. "What now?" she asked me. We keep going, I said, a sense of relief washing over me. We're going to make this work. I'm not looking back in. Brooke smiled, but there was no joy in it. She wasn't celebrating yet. She knew the road ahead would be difficult. But she also knew I wasn't going to back down. I couldn't. For the first time in my life, I was building something that was mine. The days that followed were a blur of excitement and fear. I had no safety net now. Every decision, every step forward was mine to make. But it was also freeing. Every day I woke up with a sense of purpose. Every job I took on, every satisfied client, was a reminder of why I had made this leap. But the calls kept coming. Every time I picked up the phone, it was either Dad or Colin. I did nothing left to say. There was nothing. Working at Morrison Heating and Cooling for another 2 weeks, just as I had said I would. I didn't want to leave my co-workers in the lurch. I trained the new senior installer on the systems I had designed, made sure the transitions would be as smooth as possible. But every time I saw Colin, every time I had to clean up another one of his mistakes, it reinforced the fact that the right decision. The last 2 weeks were a mix of resentment and relief. The work was the same, but the tension in the air was palpable. Colin kept trying to play the part of the big boss, but it was clear that he wasn't cut out for it. Every day I saw the company fall apart a little more. But I wasn't there to fix it anymore. That was their problem now. On my last day, I cleaned out my desk, turned in the keys, and walked out of the office. It should have been harder, but it wasn't. I felt lighter than I had in years. I had taken the first step into my future, and I knew there was no turning back. Morrison Heating and Cooling within the year. I heard the rumors through Uncle Ray, through suppliers, through contractors who had worked with us for years. The company couldn't keep its head above water. They tried to get loans, but the bank wouldn't touch them. Colin's mismanagement had caught up with them. Clients left, employees quit, and suppliers started demanding payment up front. One day I heard that Dad had tried to sell the business, but the offers were laughable. They couldn't get anywhere near what Dad had hoped for. Eventually, they filed for bankruptcy protection. They liquidated the assets, sold the equipment for pennies on the dollar, and shut the doors for good. After 30 was over. Colin, true to form, packed up and moved out of state. He went to work in his wife's family's restaurant business. Something where his lack of technical knowledge wouldn't matter as much. As for Dad and Mom, I didn't hear much from them. I knew Dad took it hard. He had spent 3 decades building the company, and watching it crumble must have been devastating, no matter how many excuses he had made for Colin's mistakes. It didn't feel like victory, exactly. It wasn't about proving them wrong, it was about finally stepping away and doing something that was mine. Something I had built from the ground up. Brooke and I kept building Coleman Climate Control. It wasn't always easy, but it was rewarding. We were doing things the right way. The quality of our work spoke for itself. We didn't chase after the lowest stuff, after the clients who valued expertise and reliability. And it worked. The business grew steadily. We moved into commercial projects, expanded our team, and by the end of the 2nd year we were doing well. A few months after the collapse of Morrison Heating and Cooling, I got a call from a former client. The property management company that had switched to a competitor when Morrison folded. They were unhappy with the service they were getting and wondered if we were interested in bidding for their maintenance contract. I couldn't believe it. The account was worth $320,000 annually, more than the contract Morrison had to bid. We got the bid. We got the contract. And that was the turning point for Coleman Climate Control. From that moment on, it felt like everything clicked into place. I continued to hear updates from the industry grapevine. Morrison Heating and Cooling had tried everything they could to stay afloat. But nothing worked. The business had burned through its cash flow and couldn't recover. Dad and Colin's mistakes had sealed its fate. The year we landed the property management contract was the same year we hired our first employee, a young guy named Austin. He reminded me of myself when I first started, eager, hardworking, ready to learn. He was a natural fit for our team. By month 9, we were seeing steady revenue around $40,000 monthly. By the time our 3rd year rolled around, we had grown into a legitimate business. We were bringing in consistent, stable revenue, and the team was strong. We had an office, a workshop, a fleet of trucks, and a growing list of clients who trusted us for high-quality work. We weren't trying to be the biggest or the cheapest. We were just trying to be the best. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the pride I felt every time we completed a job, about seeing the client's satisfaction, knowing I had earned their trust. That was what kept me going. Then, one day a phone call came in. It was from Dad. It had been almost 2 years since we'd spoken. The last time we talked, I had walked away from the family business and started my own. I didn't know what to expect when I picked up the phone. "Harry, it's your dad," he said, his voice smaller than I remembered. "We need to talk." I felt a knot tightening, but I kept my voice steady. "What about?" "I'm proud of what you've built," he said. "I see now. I made a mistake with the succession plan. I should have recognized what you were capable of." I paused for a moment, the words. This wasn't the conversation I had expected. But there was no bitterness in his voice, no anger, just... "Yeah," I said quietly. "You did. But you weren't the only one who made a mistake." There was a long silence on the other end. "I know," he finally said. "I was blinded by my own expectations. I thought Colin was the one who would take over. But I see now that I was wrong." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. My emotions were all over the place. "It's in the past, Dad," I said finally. "What's done is done. I've moved on." "I know," he said. "I just wanted to tell you that I'm proud of you, and I regret the way I treated you." The conversation ended there. We didn't make plans to meet or talk again, but it felt like a kind of closure. It wasn't an apology I'd been waiting for, but it was enough to put things to rest. A few weeks later, I ran into Kyle at a restaurant. It was completely random, and when I saw him across the room, I wasn't sure if he would come over or avoid me. But he walked straight to my table. "Hey," he said awkwardly, "I heard your company's doing well." "Yeah, too," I said, keeping my tone neutral. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry about how everything went down." I raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Colin wasn't apologize for anything." "I appreciate that," I said. He nodded. "For what it's worth, I wasn't ready to run that company. I didn't understand what I didn't know until it was too late." "That takes guts to admit," I said, meaning it. "Yeah, well, it's easier now that everything's over," he said, looking down at the floor. We stood in awkward silence for a moment before he walked back to his table. Brooke looked at me as he walked away. "I apologized," she said. I nodded. "Yeah," I accepted it. "But that doesn't change anything. We're both living with the choices we made." It was strange to think that I didn't feel angry anymore. I had let go of that bitterness over the years. Colin had been a victim of my father's expectations, just like I had been. He wasn't a bad person, he just hadn't been given the tools to succeed, and in the end, neither of us had. A few months later, Dad called again. This time, his voice sounded different. "I want to get together, Harry. Can we talk?" I didn't know if I was ready for another conversation like that, but I knew it was something I had to consider. Life had changed, and so had we. Maybe it was time to start rebuilding something. Or maybe it wasn't. Either way, I was fine with whatever happened. I hadn't seen Dad in over 2 years, and I wasn't sure how I felt about connecting. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't worried. I had built my own future, and whatever happened from here on out, I was at peace with it.